The 12 Tasks of Rue. The bar stank of beer and sweat, the way pubs had since God knows when, and you know what? No one seemed to mind. Mick Rue Johnson, once a legend in the dive bars of this sunburnt country, had returned, not with a fanfare of trumpets and angels, but with a busted-up ute and a sore back from the 6-hour drive. Last anyone had seen him, Rue had buggered off to Perth after some personal catastrophe, the kind that swings a bloke sideways and makes him question if he's made of the stuff his old man was. Now, Rue was back in the smelly heart of suburbia, Cronulla, 1997. Mullets were thinning out, but still clinging on for dear life, much like the mates Rue hadn't seen in years. The outside world was changing, shifting under the weight of tech and tits. But inside the pub, nothing much had changed. Fark, you could still smoke. He scratched at his stubble, peered around the room, and sculled his beer. Mick wasn't here for the company, but it came to him anyway. Always did. Blokes attracted blokes. Blokes with bullshit, that is. "Rue, you crazy bastard," a voice from across the bar. It was Matty, looking exactly the same as when Rue last saw him. Red hair thinning, belly rounder, eyes as bloodshot as ever. "Matty," Rue noted, lifting his beer in a half-hearted cheers. "You been off with the bloody gods or what, mate? Last we heard, you were punching out lions in the circus or something." Rue grimaced. Something like that. It wasn't far from the truth. He'd lived out something like one of those old Greek myths, struggling his way through work and bad luck like Hercules. Only his tasks weren't killing monsters or nicking cattle. They were trying to get his life back together, and like most things, that didn't go to plan. Matty slapped his back hard enough to rattle Rue's rib cage. "Good to see you, mate. Thought you gotten stuck in a kangaroo's pouch or some other stupid Rue thing." Rue's eyes flicked to the bar where old man Vic poured out another round. "Yeah, well, turns out I didn't need to go to the outback to fight monsters. Plenty of 'em right here." Matty chuckled, then leaned in. "What happened, mate?" Rue sighed. He wasn't ready to spill his guts, but the blokes would know soon enough. It'd be all over town by tomorrow morning. Word of mouth travels fast in small towns, especially when the gossip's about someone who could have been a contender. Maybe not in sport, but in life, or at least in surviving the mess of it. "Long story short, mate," Rue muttered, scratching his head, "I've been doing some soul-searching, you could say. Got mixed up in a few things, rodeos and singing, and somehow made it out alive." Matty grinned wide. "Sounds like bullshit to me, Rue." Rue grinned back, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, bulls are just cows with extra problems, right? Task 1, icing the beer." Mick Rue Johnson stood at the door of his half-boarded rental house, the same weather-beaten shack he'd abandoned in a cloud of cigarette smoke and piss a few years back. The paint was peeling like dead skin on a sunburnt back, the windows were still cracked, and the front yard resembled a junkyard more than a garden. But it was home, if you could call it that. Rue kicked at a broken beer bottle in the driveway, squinting through the haze of the late afternoon sun. The only real difference between now and then was the pile of unpaid bills sitting on the kitchen counter. Those damn things multiplied faster than cockroaches. Not that Rue gave much thought to them. The list of people he owed was as long as his memory was short. And that was saying something, because Rue's memory wasn't what it used to be. Years of cheap grog and even cheaper cigarettes had blurred the edges of everything. But there was one debt he couldn't forget, no matter how much he tried, one task he couldn't dodge. It gnawed at him like a hangover you couldn't shake off. His old man's voice rattling around in his skull, clear as day, the only thing that hadn't been drowned out by booze and brawls. Ice the beer, his old man had always said. That's step one. Ice the beer and everything else'll sort itself out. It was one of those rules of life that never made it onto the back of a toilet door, but should have. Cold beer meant life was good, or at least bearable. You could lose your job, wreck your ute, or cop a fine from the dodgy cop around the corner, but if your beer was cold, somehow it all seemed a little less dire. Rue had lived by that rule since he was old enough to hold a stubby. He let out a long sigh, shuffled inside, and tossed his flannel onto the couch. The house smelled like mold and regret, but he was too tired to care. He dragged his sorry arse into the kitchen, cracked open the fridge door, and stared at the half-empty shelves like they were going to reveal some secret to fixing his life. They didn't, but the dozen warm beers rattling in the fridge door reminded him of his first priority. "Ice the bloody beer," he muttered to himself, repeating the mantra. He reached for the plastic ice tray buried at the back of the freezer, one of those cheap ones that always promised easy release but never delivered. Rue twisted the tray in his hands, grimacing as the ice cube stubbornly clung to the plastic, refusing to budge. He tried again, gritting his teeth as the tray creaked but didn't crack. "Bloody hell!" Rue spat, chucking the tray onto the countertop. He stared at it like it was the source of all his problems, the frustration building in his chest. Here it was, Mick Rue Johnson, the so-called legend of Cronulla, a bloke who'd survived pub brawls, dodged crooked cops, and stared down Big Trev at the surf club without blinking, brought to his knees by an ice tray. The absurdity of it gnawed at him, the realization that life had boiled down to this. Icing a beer shouldn't be this bloody hard. That's when it hit him, the uncomfortable thought settling in his mind like a weight he couldn't shake off. The gods, the buggers, were watching. They always were. Ever since he came back to the Shire, they'd been toying with him, setting him up with impossible tasks, laughing from whatever high perch they sat on as he stumbled through life. Maybe his labors weren't about slaying mythical beasts, but they were still bloody hard. And icing the beer, that was just as much a challenge as anything else. Rue ran a hand through his tangled hair, staring at the tray. It was like one of those bloody Greek myths his old man used to drone on about when he'd had too many at the pub. The 12 labors of Hercules or some such nonsense, except Rue wasn't facing down a lion or a hydra. He was facing down an ice tray, a stack of unpaid bills, and the overwhelming realization that his life was one long string of disappointments. But there was no turning back. That was the thing about blokes like Rue. You could beat them. Down, you could laugh at them, and you could curse them with 1,000 little tasks that seemed impossible. But they'd keep going. They had to. It was in the blood. He reached for the tray again, his fingers gripping the sides like he was about to wrestle it into submission. He gave it another twist. The plastic groaned, and a few stubborn cubes finally popped free, clattering onto the counter like tiny, cold victories. "Gotcha, you bastard," Rue muttered, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was something. He dropped the cubes into a bucket, grabbed a 6-pack from the fridge, and tossed them in. The hiss of the ice against the warm cans was oddly satisfying, like the sound of a long-forgotten peace settling in. The weight on his shoulders lifted slightly. Maybe his old man had been onto something after all. Ice the beer, and everything else would sort itself out. Rue grabbed a cold one from the pile, popped the tab, and took a long, slow swig. The bitter taste of the beer washed over his tongue, cold and sharp, cutting through the fog in his brain. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and leaned against the counter, staring out the cracked window at the fading light outside. Life wasn't perfect. Hell, it wasn't even good. But for the first time in a long while, Mick felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a grip on things. The fridge was still rattling, the bills were still piled up, and the same old blokes were still expecting their favors to be returned, but the beer was cold, and in that moment it was enough. As he stood there sipping his beer, the weight of the past few years seemed to settle in his bones, not in a crushing way, but in a way that made him feel grounded, the kind of weight that reminded him he was still standing, still fighting, still here. His phone buzzed on the counter, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. It was probably another mate needing something, or worse, one of the blokes he owed, but something made him pick it up. "Rue, mate, it's Shane O." The voice crackled through the speaker. "Got another job for you. Bit of a sticky one, but reckon you're the only bloke who can pull it off." Rue sighed, shaking his head with a smirk. Of course there was another job. There always was. Life in Cronulla wasn't about getting ahead. It was about getting by, one task at a time. And right now, with the cold beer in his hand and the ice slowly melting in the bucket, Mick Rue Johnson figured he could handle whatever came next. "Righto, Shane-o," Rue said, setting the beer down and grabbing his keys. "What's the job?" Because at the end of the day it didn't matter how impossible the task seemed. You iced the beer and you kept going. Task 2. Taking out the bins. Mike Rue Johnson was no fool. He knew the traps of domestic life as well as any bloke. There were the obvious pitfalls, marriage, kids, mortgages, but it was the smaller things, the mundane tasks, that could really trip you up. And out of all of them, taking out the bins had to be the lowest. It wasn't even a job in his mind. It felt like an insult. Still, he wasn't about to shirk it. If the old gods of Cronulla demanded Rue take out the bins, who was he to refuse? He might have dodged a lot of responsibilities in his life, work, bills, and more than a few relationships, but there was something about this one that felt inevitable, like the trash had been waiting for him, building up in some karmic balance until it was his turn to face it head on. Rue stood over the kitchen bin, glaring at it like it had wronged him personally. The bag inside was swollen, nearly bursting at the seams with the accumulated filth of the past few weeks. He'd ignored it as long as he could. The stink had crept through the house slowly, sneaking up on him until there was no escape. Now it was unavoidable. With a grunt, he grabbed the edges of the bag and yanked it free. The smell hit him like a punch to the face. Stale beer, old curry, and something far worse that he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the week-old prawns, or maybe it was just the smell of his own life decaying in that bin. But whatever it was, it made him gag. "Bloody hell," he muttered, holding his breath as he tied the bag off, the knot barely holding. It was too heavy, too full of things he didn't want to deal with, literally and metaphorically. But there was no avoiding it now. He had to take it out, like he'd taken out everything else in his life, one stinking bag of trash at a time. The kitchen door creaked as he pushed it open with his shoulder, the evening air hitting his face like a cool slap. Outside, The neighborhood was quiet, the streets of Cronulla dark and empty. The flickering streetlight down the road cast long shadows over the cracked pavement, and Rue could hear the distant crash of the waves rolling in, the only sound louder than his own heavy breathing. He trudged toward the wheelie bin at the edge of the yard, each step slow and deliberate. The bag was heavy, pulling at his arm like the weight of all the mistakes he'd ever made, dragging him back toward the ground. There was a reason he hated taking out the bins, and it wasn't just the stink. It was the reminder that no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't ignore the mess forever. Eventually, it piled up, rotting away until you had no choice but to deal with it. As he dropped the bag into the bin with a heavy thud, a flash of memory hit him. Rue stood still for a moment, caught in the past, seeing his old man standing right there at the edge of the driveway, his arm around Rue's shoulder. The old man had that same look on his face he always did when he was about to drop some wisdom on Rue, whether he wanted to hear it or not. "Life's simple, Rue," his dad had said, voice gravelly from years of smokes and hard living. "You do what needs doing. No whinging, no shortcuts. Just get it done." Rue had never been great at listening to his old man, not when he was alive, and especially not after he was gone. But that one lesson stuck, whether he liked it or not. It was the mantra his old man had lived by, and in some way, Rue had picked it up too. Get it done, no matter how much it stank. Now, years later, Rue found himself living by those same words, standing alone in the dark, taking out the bins like it was some sacred rite. He might have lived his life dodging responsibilities, but there were some things you couldn't avoid. The bins were one of them, and maybe that was the point. Maybe it was the little things, taking out the trash, fixing a leaky tap, icing the beer, that kept life from completely falling apart. He closed the lid of the bin with a satisfying slam and stood there for a moment, staring out at the street. The air smelled better out here, fresher, cleaner. It wasn't like the bush, where you could breathe deep and only smell the trees and the dirt and the honest stink of your own sweat. But it was better than inside, where the air stank of failure, stale beer, and regret. For a moment, Rue let himself remember the old days before life had piled up on him like a trash heap, back when his old man was still alive, back when the biggest problem was making sure there was cold beer in the fridge and footy on the telly, back when the simple things made sense, and you didn't have to question every little decision or wonder if you'd taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. But those days were long gone, buried under the same rubbish he was dealing with now. His old man had been right, though. There were no shortcuts, not in Cronulla, not in life. You had to deal with what was in front of you, whether it was taking out the bins or dealing with the bigger messes you'd made for yourself along the way. Mike sighed and lit a durry, the warm glow of the cigarette tip cutting through the darkness. He took a long drag and exhaled, watching the smoke curl into the night sky. His body relaxed, the familiar burn of nicotine soothing him in a way that nothing else could. He stood there, watching the bin like it was some kind of marker, an altar to all the crap he'd carried with him over the years, all the things he'd thrown away but still couldn't quite get rid of. "Get it done," Rue muttered to himself, the words hanging in the air with the smoke. It was a simple enough motto, but it carried weight. He might not have much to show for himself, no house, no steady job, no family waiting for him at home, but he still got it done, Whatever it was, he wasn't a hero, but he was still standing in Cronulla. That was enough. Rue flicked his cigarette butt into the gutter and turned to head back inside, his shoulders a little lighter. The bins were out. The trash was gone, at least for now. Tomorrow, there'd be more. There always was. But tonight, the air was fresh, the bin was empty, and the beer was cold. And for Mick Rue Johnson, that was enough to get by. As he walked up the steps, his old man's voice echoed in his head one more time, a steady reminder of the truth. No whinging, no shortcuts, just get it done. It wasn't much, but it was all Rue had. And in this corner of the world, in the small, messy life he'd carved out for himself, it was enough. Task 3. Regulating the kids. Mike Rue Johnson was no stranger to chaos, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't a brawl at the pub or a dust-up with some pissed-off bloke at the beach. This was pure, unbridled bedlam. And the worst part, it wasn't even his mess. These weren't his kids. Thank Christ for that. Nah, this was his sister Sandy's mob, and when she dropped them off that Arvo without so much as a good luck, Rue knew he was in for the longest afternoon of his life. Sandy's feral little rugrats, 3 of the most wild-eyed kids you'd ever seen, tore through the house like a pack of rabid animals. Jaden, the eldest at 9, had all the energy of a dog off the leash after a week of rain. Behind him, the twins, Ava and Lockie, both 6 years old, followed in his wake like mini hurricanes, knocking over anything not nailed down. Rue stood there, arms crossed, watching the destruction unfold around him, wondering how the hell his life had come to this. They'd barely been inside for 5 minutes, and already the house looked like a bomb had gone off. Pot plants were tipped over, spilling soil across the floor. A half-eaten bag of chips had somehow ended up in the esky, with crumbs scattered all over the place, like someone had just thrown them for fun. One of them, he didn't know which, had pulled down the curtains in the living room, leaving them hanging by a single hook. Rue scratched his head, watching the carnage, and thought to himself, surely wrangling kids was one of Hercules' labors. If it wasn't, it bloody well should have been. "Oi!" Rue shouted over the din, his voice barely cutting through the racket. "Calm the hell down or I'll—" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing he had no idea how to finish that threat. What the hell could he threaten them with? He wasn't their old man. Hell, he wasn't even a dad at all. The only thing Rue knew about parenting was from watching his old man, and he didn't reckon that handing out backhanders was still an acceptable way to keep kids in line. Not that his old man ever bothered with threats. He'd just wait until you did something stupid, then smack you upside the head without warning. But Rue wasn't that kind of bloke, not really. He wasn't going to belt his sister's kids, even if they were currently trying to dismantle his house, brick by brick. "Oi, what did I just say?" Rue yelled again, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and confusion. His arms waved uselessly in the air as the 3 kids continued their onslaught, completely ignoring him. Suddenly, there was a thunk. Something hit Rue square in the forehead. A remote control, launched with the kind of precision that would make a professional dart player proud. Rue blinked, stunned for a moment, before the red haze of rage began to creep over him. He wasn't usually one to lose his temper, but between the trashed house and the throbbing knot forming on his skull, he was about 5 seconds away from snapping. "That's it!" Rue roared, his patience finally gone. "I'm regulating you lot, one by one." The words barely left his mouth before the kids scattered, shrieking with delight. They didn't see a pissed-off uncle. They saw a game. Rue groaned, running a hand through his messy hair as they disappeared into the various rooms of his already trashed rental. This wasn't just a task anymore. It was a bloody cruel joke, one that the universe was having at his expense. He stomped into the hallway, his boots heavy on the floor as he tried to figure out where they'd gone. The house wasn't big, but when you've got 3 feral kids bent on hiding from you, it may as well be a maze. He started with the living room, ripping open the wardrobe door only to find it empty, except for his old surfboard and some random crap he'd tossed in there years ago. "Jaden!" Rue bellowed, his frustration mounting. "Get your arse out here!" No answer. The house was dead silent now, which, in a way, was worse. Kids were never quiet unless they were plotting something. He moved into the kitchen next, eyes darting around for any sign of movement. One of the cabinet doors was half open, and Rue had a sinking feeling. He grabbed the handle and yanked it open, expecting to find one of the twins crammed inside. Instead, he was greeted with an avalanche of empty cereal boxes and old takeaway containers he hadn't bothered to throw out. "Shit," he muttered, kicking the mess out of the way as he headed towards the back of the house. That's when he heard it. A giggle. Quiet, but unmistakable. It was coming from the laundry. He stormed in, ripping open the door, only to find Jaden crouched behind the washing machine, grinning like a little devil. "Gotcha!" Rue growled, grabbing the kid by the collar and dragging him into the hallway. "Now sit there and don't move." Jaden squirmed, but Rue's grip was solid. "You can't catch the others, Uncle Mick," the kid taunted, kicking at the air. Rue's eye twitched. "Watch me." He stomped down the hall again, this time with purpose. He wasn't playing around anymore. The twins were next, and he knew their hiding spots wouldn't be as clever as Jaden's. Lockie had a tendency to hide in plain sight, and sure enough, when Rue barged into the bathroom, he found the kid curled up in the empty bathtub, laughing his head off. "Out!" Rue commanded, pointing to the hallway. Lockie scrambled out, still giggling, and ran back to where Jaden sat, giving his sister up immediately. "Ava's under the bed," he shouted, as if that wasn't obvious. Ava, the sneakier of the two, had managed to wedge herself underneath Rue's bed, her feet sticking out from one side. Rue crouched down, grabbing her by the ankles and pulling her out like he was fishing for crab pots. She shrieked with laughter, kicking her feet and making a fuss, but Rue didn't let go. "Right," Rue said, dragging Ava into the hallway where her brother sat, grinning like idiots. "You lot sit there, no more running, no more throwing shit, and definitely no more hiding. Got it?" The kids, panting from their wild game, nodded. But Rue could see the mischievous glint in their eyes. They'd won this round, and they knew it. He stood there, arms crossed, staring them down like he was about to deliver some serious life lesson, but nothing came to mind. What was he supposed to say? He wasn't their dad. He wasn't even cut out for this crap. But somehow, against all odds, he'd survived the afternoon. The house was wrecked. His head throbbed where the remote had clocked him, but the kids were contained. That was as good as it was going to get. For a brief, glorious moment, there was silence. Rue leaned against the wall, letting out a long breath, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. "Uncle Mick?" Jaden piped up, breaking the silence. Rue groaned. "What? Can we go outside and kick the footy?" Rue considered the request for a moment, On the one hand, the last thing he wanted to do was play footy with a bunch of feral kids. On the other hand, if they were outside, they wouldn't be destroying his house anymore. "Yeah, all right," he muttered, rubbing his temples, "but no bloody rough housing." The kids whooped with joy, jumping to their feet and racing for the backyard before Roo could even finish his sentence. Roo watched them go, shaking his head. Maybe wrangling kids hadn't been one of Hercules's labors, but after an afternoon like this, it damn well should have been. Task 4, the laundry from hell. The washing machine was definitely possessed. Mike Roo Johnson had dealt with his fair share of dodgy appliances, but this was something else. The clanking, the grinding, the violent shudders that made it look like it might break through the laundry floor. There was no other explanation. It was like the thing had been cursed by some ancient vengeful spirit. Roo stood in front of it, arms crossed, glaring at the machine as if he could stare it into submission. "Just work," he muttered, his voice low and full of frustration. As if to make his point clearer, he gave it a solid kick with his steel-capped boot. The machine responded by rattling louder, the noise rising to a metallic crescendo that made it sound like it was about to explode. Roo backed away a step, half expecting the thing to blow a hole through the wall and take half the house with it. "Bloody piece of junk!" he spat, rubbing a hand through his tangled mess of hair. Laundry had never been his strong suit. Back in the day, it wasn't his problem. If his clothes started to reek, usually after a week of hard living, he'd just chuck them in a plastic bag and drop them off at his sister Sandy's place. A day or two later, they'd show up at his door, clean, folded, and smelling like lavender. It was like magic, except Roo knew the real magic was Sandy having her life together enough to handle her own kids and his filthy laundry at the same time. But things were different now. Sandy had her hands full with her feral brood, and Roo, he had to fend for himself. That meant facing the beast in the laundry. The washing machine that looked like it belonged in a museum for outdated household appliances. The kind of thing that probably had a label on it somewhere saying, "Made in 1974. Roo stared at the pile of dirty clothes sitting at his feet. Most of them were jeans, flannel shirts, and a few pairs of socks that were beyond saving. The stink coming off the pile was enough to make his eyes water. Beer, stale sweat, old barbecue sauce, and God knows what else. It was a catalog of all his bad decisions from the past few weeks. "Right," he muttered to himself, grabbing a handful of the mess and chucking it into the machine. The thing groaned in protest like it knew it was being asked to do something far beyond its capabilities. Roo slammed the door shut and stood back, cracking his knuckles as though he were about to take on a new opponent. The buttons on the front of the machine looked foreign to him, a confusing mess of symbols and faded text. He hadn't the faintest idea what half of them did, but he figured it couldn't be that hard. Just press a bloody button and let it go, he thought. So he did just that. He pressed the start button, and the machine lurched into action. For a second, Roo thought he'd won. The drum inside the machine started to spin slowly, water trickling in. But then the clanking started again, louder this time, as if the machine was trying to shake itself apart. "Don't you dare!" Roo growled, giving it another sharp kick. He stared at it, trying to will it into compliance. But the machine had other ideas. The noise grew louder, more violent, and Roo could feel the vibrations under his feet. It was like a full-on earthquake happening right there in his laundry. He sighed deeply, running a hand down his face. This was ridiculous. He'd faced down blokes twice his size in pub fights, wrestled a ute out of a ditch with his bare hands, and dealt with Big Trev after a skinful at the surf club, but this bloody washing machine was about to break him. It was another task, another trial from the universe, a punishment for years of skiving off responsibility. He tried a new tactic. He opened the machine mid-cycle, hoping to reset whatever was going wrong. A stream of water gushed out, soaking his boots. "Great," Rue muttered, grabbing a mop to clean up the mess. He mopped up the water, then stood back again, arms crossed, staring down the beast as though he were gearing up for another round. "All right, mate, I'll give you one more chance," he muttered, slamming the door shut and hitting the start button once again. The machine wheezed back to life, and this time it seemed to get into a rhythm. The drum spun slower, but steadier. The water flowed, and for a moment Rue thought he might have fixed it. But that hope was short-lived. Just as he was starting to feel like the machine was on his side, it let out a high-pitched screech and stopped dead. Rue's heart sank. The damn thing had jammed again, the lights on the front panel blinking in some mysterious pattern that looked like Morse code for "you're screwed." Rue leaned forward and pressed his forehead against the cold metal of the machine, letting out a long, deep sigh. This was the last thing he needed. Laundry had never been part of the grand plan. Hell, there wasn't even a grand plan anymore. His life had boiled down to fixing one disaster after another. Some days it felt like the gods had put him here just to see how much crap he could take. After wrestling with the machine for another hour, jamming his hands into the drum, twisting the buttons and kicking it so many times his foot hurt, the washing machine finally sputtered to life again. It wasn't pretty. It groaned, it rattled, but it managed to finish the cycle. When Rue opened the door, the machine spat out a load of clothes that were half washed, dripping wet and still smelling like stale beer. He grabbed a handful of the soggy mess, held it up to his face, and gave it a sniff. "Brilliant," he muttered, tossing the clothes into the laundry basket. It was hardly a victory, but it was something. The washing was technically done, even if the clothes were barely wearable. He stared down at the soggy mess in the basket and sighed again. If this was his punishment for all the years of slacking off, then maybe he deserved it. But deep down, he knew this was more than just about laundry. It was symbolic of all the little things he'd avoided in life. Rue had spent years dodging responsibility, pushing things aside, hoping someone else would deal with the mess for him. Now, with no one left to clean up after him, he had to face the music. He had to deal with the laundry, the literal and figurative piles of crap that had built up around him. There was no magic fix, no shortcut, and no one to bail him out. Rue carried the basket of half-washed clothes to the backyard, where an old clothesline sagged between two rusting metal poles. He pegged up the clothes one by one, the wet fabric dripping onto the dry dirt beneath his feet. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. As he hung the last shirt, Rue stepped back, hands on his hips, and looked at the line of clothes fluttering weakly in the breeze. It wasn't perfect. Hell, it wasn't even close. But he'd gotten it done. It might have taken him all afternoon, and the washing machine might have tried to kill him in the process, but he'd finished the job. That had to count for something. Lighting a durry, Rue took a long drag and blew the smoke into the fading evening light. There was a certain satisfaction in it, in getting something done, even if it was as small as laundry. He turned to head back inside, already dreading the next task the universe would throw at him. But for now, at least, the laundry from hell was behind him, and that was enough. Task 5. The Mower's Curse. Mowing the lawn. Of all the tasks the universe could throw at Mick Rue Johnson, this one seemed the most straightforward. He'd done it 1,000 times growing up, back when his old man would holler at him from the veranda, a VB in hand, yelling something about learning responsibility or earning your keep. Rue never paid much attention to the lecture, but he knew how to get the job done. Mowing was simple. Push the mower, cut the grass. Easy as. But today, nothing was bloody easy anymore. Rue stood in the middle of his overgrown front yard, the grass tall enough to lose a dog in, and stared at the ancient, rusted-out lawn-mower in front of him. The thing was a relic, a hand-me-down from his old man that looked more like a carcass than a piece of machinery. The metal was rusting around the edges, the handles were held together with duct tape, and the blades underneath had seen better days. It barely worked the last time he'd used it, and today it looked like it had been pulled straight out of a scrap heap. Still, it had one job, and so did Rue. "Right, let's get this over with," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. It was barely mid-morning, but the sun was already blazing, and the humidity clung to him like a wet blanket. The air was thick with the smell of eucalyptus, salt, and that faint, musty scent of grass that had been left to grow too long. Rue grabbed the starter cord and gave it a solid yank. Nothing. He tried again, harder this time, grunting as he pulled. The engine coughed and spluttered, then fell silent. Rue glared at the mower like it had personally offended him. "One more pull," he told himself. "Third time's the charm." He yanked the cord again, his muscles straining, and finally the engine roared to life with all the enthusiasm of a drunk uncle at Christmas. The mower shuddered, sputtered, but it was running, for now. "Good enough," Rue grumbled, pushing it forward. The blades clunked and whirred, hacking through the tall grass like a blunt axe. The lawn was an absolute wreck. Tufts of weeds and dry patches mingled with overgrown blades that had gone wild in the summer heat. He could barely see where he was going, the mower struggling to chew through the jungle in front of him. Still, Rue pressed on. He wasn't after a perfect cut. He just wanted the job done. As he made his way down the yard, his mind wandered. He thought about his old man, the gruff bloke who had given him this mower all those years ago. "Take care of the lawn, and it'll take care of you," his dad used to say. Another one of his endless pieces of advice that Rue had ignored. His dad had been the type to get up at the crack of dawn, do a full day's work, and then come home and mow the lawn, fix the car, and tinker in the shed until dark. Rue had never been built that way. His approach to life was more about getting by, doing just enough to keep things together without tipping into total disaster. But today felt different. Today, the mower's obstinate refusal to cooperate felt like a sign, a cruel joke from the universe, as if the gods themselves were watching him struggle and having a laugh at his expense. It was one of those days where nothing seemed to go right, and this bloody lawn was just the latest in a long line of small, irritating battles. Halfway through the yard, the mower let out a high-pitched whine, sputtered, and died with a final pathetic cough. Rue stopped in his tracks, staring down at the machine as if it had just insulted his mother. "Don't you bloody dare," he muttered, giving the mower a swift kick. The thing rattled but remained silent, the engine dead. Rue growled under his breath, yanking the starter cord again. Nothing. He tried again, harder this time, and still the mower refused to cooperate. "Bloody hell!" Rue spat, kicking it again for good measure. He stood back, hands on his hips, and glared at the heap of metal and rust that had once been a functioning mower. The grass was only half cut, a jagged line where the mower had given up, and the rest of the yard stretched out in front of him like a challenge he had no chance of winning. Rue wiped the sweat from his brow, staring out at the mess of overgrown grass and weeds, and let out a long sigh. This wasn't just about the lawn anymore. It never was. It was about life, about the endless parade of small, annoying tasks that piled up, one after the other, until you found yourself standing in your front yard, sweating buckets, wrestling with a broken-down lawn mower, and wondering where the hell it had all gone wrong. He crouched down beside the mower, running a hand over the rusted frame, trying to figure out what had gone wrong this time. He wasn't a mechanic, but he knew enough to get by. Still, this machine was ancient, and there was only so much duct tape and swearing could fix. Rue gave it another yank, and this time the mower gave a weak sputter before dying again. He sat back on his heels, feeling the weight of the morning press down on him. It wasn't just the mower, it was everything. The broken washing machine, the kids running riot, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. It felt like life had become one long string of things breaking down, and no matter how hard Rue tried, he couldn't keep up. For a moment, he thought about just leaving the lawn as it was, half mowed, half wild, like some kind of artistic statement about how life was never really finished. But then he heard his old man's voice in his head, that gruff, no-nonsense tone that had never quite left him. "Get it done, Rue. No whinging, no shortcuts. Just get it done." Rue let out a long breath and stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He wasn't about to let some cursed mower beat him. Not today. If he had to push the damn thing across the yard by hand, he'd get it done. He grabbed the starter cord one more time, gave it a good hard pull, and to his surprise, the engine roared back to life, coughing and sputtering like it was on its last legs, but running nonetheless. "That's more like it," Rue muttered, pushing the mower forward again. The blades hacked through the grass, uneven and rough, but cutting all the same. Rue could feel the tension in his shoulders easing as he made his way across the yard, watching the overgrown mess disappear behind him. By the time he finished, the lawn was far from perfect, but it was done. The grass was cut, the mower had survived, and Rue stood there, hands on his hips, surveying the scene. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Another task ticked off the list. "Bloody gods," Rue muttered, wiping the sweat from his face. "One of these days I'm going to have a word with you lot." He pushed the mower back to the shed, his body aching but satisfied. It was another small victory, another reminder that no matter how much life tried to throw at him, he could handle it. One cursed task at a time. Task 6. The Beast of the Shire. Mick Rue Johnson rolled out of bed like a wreck, face still glued to the pillow from a mix of drool and last night's cheap booze. His head pounded in rhythm with the distant sound of waves crashing on the beach. The sharp tang of stale beer hung in the air, and the faint sting of cigarette smoke still clung to the room. Mick didn't know how he hadn't drowned in his own slop, but he was a battler, had been all his life. The cold tiles of his Cronulla flat bit into his skin as he scraped himself off the floor. Outside, the sky was a washed-out blue, a mirror of his brain, empty, but with the vague sense that something needed doing. He rubbed his eyes, squinting at the sunlight streaming in through the window. It was one of those days, and from the ache in his skull, Mike had a feeling it was about to get worse. "Oi, Mick, you're a dead-set muppet if you reckon you'll dodge this one." Shano's voice boomed from the front yard, loud enough to make Mike's head throb even harder. Shano, his best mate since high school, was leaning against the fence, a grin on his face that said trouble was coming. Mike rubbed the back of his neck, trying to remember what had gone down last night. The memories were hazy, muddled by too many schooners and a few too many shots of whiskey. But something about a dare stuck out, a challenge, a task, the kind of thing you couldn't just walk away from. That was how it worked in the Shire. You reckon you're tough? You step up or shut up. No one cared if you had a hangover from hell or if your knees were still shaking from the night before. Mike grunted, pulling on his faded flannel, stiff from sweat and beer. His armpits reeked like a petrol station in the middle of summer, but that didn't matter. He had bigger things to deal with today. A beast to face. The first of 6 labors, if Shano's slurred talk from the night before was to be believed. Life in Cronulla wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about proving you were still standing after everything the Shire threw at you. And today, the Shire had thrown the beast his way. The beast of the Shire wasn't some mythical creature, nothing like those Greek monsters his old man used to drone on about when he got tanked. Nah, this beast was far more real. A roided-up meathead from the local gym, Big Trev. He was the kind of bloke you didn't cross unless you were looking to get your teeth knocked in. Built like a brick shithouse, Trev had arms thicker than Mike's waist and thighs the size of a washing machine. His presence loomed over the entire peninsula like a smog of lynx Africa and protein powder. "You remember what you said, right?" Shano asked, grinning as he pulled out a ciggy and lit it up. "You said you'd take Trev on, that it was time someone knocked him down a peg." Muck scratched his head, trying to piece it all together. Yeah, that sounded like something he'd say. Maybe it had been the grog talking, maybe it was just his stupid pride, but either way it was too late to back out now. The Shire had a long memory, and if you didn't follow through on a challenge, you'd never hear the end of it. "You got the wrong bloke, mate," Mike muttered, though even he knew that wasn't true. He tugged on his steel-capped boots, their laces frayed and stained from years of scuffles and hard living. "But reckon I could use a ciggy." Shano tossed him one, and Mick lit it, taking a deep drag and feeling the familiar burn in his throat. The thing about Trev wasn't just that he was a gym junkie with a temper. Nah, Trev was the Shire's unofficial kingpin. You wanted to move through Cronulla without getting your face smashed in, you had to go through him. He owned the local surf club in more ways than one, his crew hanging around like they were all waiting for some Hollywood audition for Cronulla's hardest blokes. "You better smash him, mate," Shano said with a grin as they headed down the road, the worn soles of their boots scuffing the pavement. The sun was higher now, the heat already starting to burn through the thin air, but the tension was what weighed heavy on Mick. It wasn't about whether he was going to win. He didn't care about that. It was about survival. You didn't have to beat Trev, not really. You just had to stand your ground long enough for people to respect you, even if it meant getting your arse kicked in the process. They reached the surf club, a run-down old building that had seen more bar fights than waves in recent years. This was Trev's kingdom. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of sweat and beer, and the low rumble of voices filled the space like the growl of a hungry beast. Trev was lounging near the pool table, a half-crushed tinny in one hand, surrounded by his crew. Mike's pulse quickened as he walked through the door, Shane-O trailing behind him like an eager spectator at a gladiator match. The room felt tighter, smaller, and the eyes of everyone in it turned toward him, waiting to see what would happen next. Big Trev lifted his head, his eyes narrowing as a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Mick Rue Johnson," he sneered, voice booming. "Come to kiss my arse or get wrecked." Mick took another drag of his ciggy, the smoke curling lazily in the air, before he flicked the butt onto the floor, grinding it under his boot. "Neither, mate," he said, his voice steady, even though his heart was racing. "I'm here to take you down." The room fell silent. Blokes who were mid-drink froze, schooners halfway to their lips, unsure whether to laugh or watch a murder in slow motion. Mick had no real plan. He'd faced down bigger problems than this, but planning wasn't his style. In Cronulla, it wasn't about strategy or smarts. It was about guts. You didn't walk into a fight with someone like Trev expecting a clean win. You walked in to prove you had the stones to face him at all. Trev's grin widened, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was the kind of smile that told you someone was about to get hurt, and Trev was about to enjoy it. He stood up towering over Mick, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the room. "Big mistake, Rue," Trev said, his voice a low growl. He tossed his tinny onto the pool table and cracked his knuckles. The sound was like distant thunder, a promise of what was to come. But Mick didn't flinch. He squared his shoulders, locking eyes with Trev. He wasn't sure if it was the alcohol still buzzing through his veins or the adrenaline kicking in, but for once in his life, Mick felt clear-headed. The first punch came out of nowhere. Trev's fist, like a freight train, aimed straight for Mick's head. Mike dodged it barely, but he felt the rush of air as it passed. He swung back, a solid right hook that connected with Trev's ribs. The room exploded in noise, blokes cheering, jeering, the bar erupting into chaos, but Mick didn't care. He was in it now, and no matter how it ended, he was going to stand his ground, because that's what you did in Cronulla. You faced the beast, and you took whatever came next. Task 7. The Bong of Eternal Bludgeoning. Mike Rue Johnson stood in the back alley behind Damo's darts and vapes, nursing a bruised jaw and a cracked tooth. The fight with Big Trev was still fresh in his mind, and his body ached like he'd gone 12 rounds with a truck. Trev might have won the day, but Mike had gotten a few solid hits in, enough to earn a grudging respect from the locals. Respect didn't heal bruises, though, and Mick was starting to wonder if he was getting too old for this kind of crap. In his hand, he held a crumpled piece of paper, the address barely legible in Shane-O's sloppy, drunken scrawl. "Oi, Mick," Shane-O had slurred, handing him the note just hours after the fight. "Reckon I found your next job, mate. Heard about this thing. Called the Bong of Eternal Bludgeoning. Blokes say you hit this thing, and you'll never have to work again." Mike had spat out a bit of blood, his lips still swollen from Trev's fists. "Sounds like a bloody myth." Shane-O had grinned, that mischievous spark in his eye. "Ain't no myth. Nugget from the south, he swears it's real. Says it's somewhere at the end of Booner Street, past the servo. Only catch is, there's a bloke guarding it, a proper nutter. You'll have to wrestle him." "Wrestle?" Mike snorted at the memory. His whole life had been a series of wrestling matches, against blokes, against bad decisions, and lately against the very idea of doing anything productive. Wrestling some bloke over a bong seemed almost poetic at this point. Still, the promise of never having to work again? That was tempting. Mick was tired of schlepping down to the bottle-o every day, dealing with the same half-drunk regulars, copping lip from his tight-arse boss. If this bong of eternal bludgeoning was real, it could be his ticket out. And if anyone deserved an eternal bludge, it was Mick Rue Johnson. Sounds too good to pass up, Mick muttered to himself, adjusting his flannel as he followed Shane-O through Cronulla's labyrinth of streets. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavements. They dodged packs of echays on scooters, the air thick with the scent of salt water and piss, before reaching the dodgiest house Mick had ever seen. It was an eyesore, even by Cronulla standards. The paint was peeling off the walls like sunburnt skin, and the front yard looked more like a graveyard for broken beer bottles and rusting Holden parts. A few overgrown weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, fighting for space among the debris. Here? Mick raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over the rundown property. Shane-O nodded, his grin even wider now. Yeah, but like I said, mate, you gotta deal with the guard first. Who's this joker? Mark asked, eyeing the front door warily. The door creaked open, and out stumbled the bloke they called Knuckles. He was a unit, easily twice Mick's size, covered head to toe in tattoos. Some of the ink was faded, others were fresh, and all of them looked like they'd been done in someone's backyard. His knuckles, true to his name, were crisscrossed with the kind of tattoos that screamed bad decisions. "Oi, who the hell's at me door?" Knuckles barked, his voice gravelly from too many darts and not enough sleep. He squinted at Mac, sizing him up like a butcher eyeing up a bit of meat. Mike took a breath, sizing Knuckles up in return. His own knuckles was still bloody from the fight with Trev, but he reckoned this bloke was beatable, if only because Mike had no intention of giving up without a fight. "I'm here for the bong, mate." Knuckles let out a low, throaty chuckle, his grin showing off a few missing teeth and the rest chipped and stained. "You reckon? Well, let's see if you earn it, you dog." Before Mike could react, Knuckles lunged. For a big bloke, he was quick. Mike barely had time to sidestep as Knuckles swung a fist the size of a sledgehammer at his head. The punch missed, but Mick felt the wind rush past his face. Mick stumbled back, his brain still playing catch-up with his body. Knuckles charged again, a wild look in his eyes, fists swinging. Mick ducked, using the only strategy he had, keep moving and don't get hit. He wasn't in the mood to cop another set of bruises today. Knuckles came in hard, his fists like bricks, but Mick was faster. He slipped to the side and landed a quick jab to Knuckles' ribs. It wasn't much, but it made Knuckles grunt and stagger back a step. "Not bad, mate," Knuckles sneered, rubbing his side. "But I'm just warming up." Muck braced himself, knowing full well that this wasn't going to end with a single punch. Knuckles was built for brawling. Mike had the scars to prove he could take a hit, but this was a whole new level of scrapping. Knuckles lunged again, this time managing to land a glancing blow to Mick's shoulder. It was like getting hit by a truck. Mike stumbled but didn't fall. He gritted his teeth and swung back, landing a solid hook to Knuckles' jaw. The big bloke staggered, and for the first time Mick saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Come on, mate." Mike taunted, shaking the paint out of his hand. "That all you got?" Knuckles growled, charging again. This time Mike was ready. He ducked low, driving his shoulder into Knuckles' gut. The big man let out a gasp as the air was knocked out of him, and before he could recover, Mick hooked a leg around Knuckles' ankle and sent him crashing to the ground. The impact shook the dirt and cracked beer bottles in the yard, and Knuckles lay there for a moment, dazed and breathless. Mick stood over him, panting and wiping the sweat from his brow. "Reckon that's a win," he muttered. Knuckles groaned, rolling onto his back with a wheezy laugh. "All right, you bastard. Fair enough." He sat up, still grinning, despite the blood trickling from his lip. "The bong's inside, but let me tell you, mate, it's more than you reckon." Mike didn't waste any time. He stepped over Knuckles and pushed open the door, the hinges creaking like they hadn't been used in years. Inside, the house was a wreck. Old furniture, stacks of dirty dishes, and the unmistakable smell of weed lingering in the air. But there, on a table in the middle of the room, sat the bong of eternal bludgeon. It was massive, carved out of wood and decorated with faded, intricate patterns. The thing looked ancient, like it had seen more stoners than Mick had seen pub brawls. He walked up to it, his heart thudding in his chest. This was it, the thing that could free him from the drudgery of work forever. No more shifts at the bottle-o, no more dealing with his boss's bullshit. Just endless bludgeoning. Mike reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the bong. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if it could really be this easy. But then again, nothing in Cronulla was ever easy. With a shrug, Mick lifted the bong to his lips, took a deep breath, and hit it. The world spun. Task 7. The Dangerous Sheila. Mike Rue Johnson stood at the bar nursing a cold beer in his hand, his lips still busted and swollen from his last brawl. The faint sting reminded him of the mess he'd just crawled out of. He had gotten his hands on the so-called bong of eternal bludgeoning, but the damn thing didn't work. Nugget from the Southie swore up and down it was a fake, and though Muck wasn't one to give up so easily, he was beginning to think he'd been had. Now, as he leaned against the sticky bar counter of the local, he had bigger things to worry about. His third task loomed over him like a hangover that wouldn't quit. "You gotta deal with her next," Shano said from beside him, nodding towards the entrance. "Her?" Mike grunted, taking a sip of his beer, already dreading whatever fresh hell Shano was about to throw his way. "You know who I'm talking about, mate. Donna," Shano said, his voice low like he was speaking the name of some dark, cursed force. "The Sheila that no bloke can handle." Mike winced. Even in the dimly lit pub, he could feel his stomach tighten. He wasn't ready for this. Donna was no ordinary woman. She was the type of Sheila who could cut a man down to size with a single glance. And Cronulla was full of stories about blokes who had tried to get close to her, only to be left shattered, bruised, and utterly humiliated. No one lasted more than 5 minutes with her before bolting out the door, their egos bruised beyond repair. "Why she's so dangerous," Mike muttered, more to himself than to Shano. "Mate, Donna's like the devil with lipstick," Shano explained, shaking his head as if the mere thought of her gave him the shivers. "She's got a mind sharper than any blade, and her tongue's even worse. She'll tear through you before you even know what hit you. No bloke survived her wit yet." Mick took another long swig of his beer, staring at the bubbles as they rose to the surface. He'd taken down Big Trev in a brawl that left him bloody, but still standing. He'd gone toe to toe with Knuckles and lived to tell the tale. But Donna? She was a different beast altogether. She wasn't all brawn and brute force. She had something far more dangerous, brains, wit, and that wicked smile that could make even the toughest bloke crumble. "Reckon I'll take me chances," Mike muttered, though deep down his gut twisted with nerves. He'd faced physical danger before, but this felt different. Mental warfare wasn't his strong suit. His best weapon was his fist, not his mouth, and Donna was notorious for taking blokes like him and chewing them up without breaking a sweat. "Good luck, mate," Shane-O said with a grin, clearly enjoying the prospect of watching his mate get torn to shreds. "You survive a night with Donna, and you'll be a bloody legend around here. No one's managed it yet." Mike pushed himself off the bar, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. Donna sat at the other end, legs crossed, sipping on a cocktail that looked out of place in a dive bar like this. She wore a fitted leather jacket, a pair of jeans that looked expensive, and a smirk that could bring down empires. Her hair, jet black and perfectly styled, framed her face. Her eyes, sharp, piercing, and full of mischief, were locked on him the second he noticed her. Mick gulped. This was it, the most dangerous labor yet. He straightened his flannel and took a deep breath, making his way across the bar. His heart pounded harder with every step. He could handle a punch, could even shake off a beer bottle to the head, but Donna's razor-sharp wit? That was a whole new ball game. As he got closer, she glanced up from her drink, raising one perfectly arched brow. "You gonna stand there all night? Or buy me a drink, mate?" Her voice was smooth, casual, but it held an edge to it, like a lioness deciding whether or not to pounce on her prey. Mick's mouth went dry. Yeah, of course," he stammered, waving to the bartender. "What are you drinking?" "Something you can't afford," she shot back with a smirk, eyeing his flannel and work boots with a raised brow. The bartender, sensing the tension, sidled over and waited for Mick to make his move. Mick fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a crumpled 20 and slapping it on the bar. "Two of whatever she's having," he muttered, trying not to show how rattled he already was. He hadn't even sat down yet, and Donna had him on the back foot. "Bold move," she said, that smirk never leaving her lips. She took a slow sip of her drink, her eyes never leaving his. "But I hope you're not just here to play bartender. You'll need to do better than that." Mick shifted in his seat, trying to gather his thoughts. He wasn't used to this, words, games, the verbal sparring that Donna seemed to thrive on. Physical fights, sure, but banter? This was her territory. "So," he said, forcing a casual tone as he leaned against the bar, "you're the infamous Donna I keep hearing about. Thought I'd see what all the fuss is." Donna let out a short, sharp laugh, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Oh, is that what you're doing? Come to see if I live up to the hype? Brave of you." She took another sip, her eyes scanning him up and down. "Let me guess. Shane-O sent you over here with some bullshit story about how surviving a night with me makes you a legend, right?" Mike chuckled nervously, running a hand through his hair. "Something like that." She shook her head, laughing softly. "Typical. You blokes never learn. Let me give you a bit of advice, Mick. This isn't about surviving me. It's about whether you've got anything interesting to offer or if you're just like the rest of them." Mick swallowed, trying to hold her gaze without flinching. There was something disarming about her, something that made him feel like he was already losing, and the fight hadn't even started. But he couldn't back down now, not with Shane O and half the pub watching. "So, what do you reckon?" he said, leaning in slightly. "Think I might be different?" Donna smirked again, her eyes dancing with mischief. "We'll see." For the next hour, Mick found himself locked in a battle unlike any he'd ever faced. Donna wasn't just clever. She was ruthless, picking apart every word he said with quick, cutting remarks that left him scrambling to keep up. She questioned everything about him, his job, his mates, his purpose, leaving him feeling like he'd walked into a trap. No matter what he said, she had an answer ready, sharp as a knife and twice as deadly. And yet Muck found himself enjoying it in a strange way. It was exhausting, sure, but there was a thrill in trying to keep up with her, in dodging her verbal jabs and throwing a few of his own, though hers were always sharper, always better aimed. By the end of the night, Mick was knackered, mentally drained but still standing. Donna finished her drink, giving him a long, appraising look. "You lasted longer than most," she admitted, her voice softer now. "Maybe you're not a complete waste of time." Mick grinned, feeling a strange sense of pride in that backhanded compliment. "Reckon I'll take that as a win." Donna stood, grabbing her jacket and tossing him one last smirk over her shoulder. "Don't get too cocky, Rue. This was just round one." As she walked out of the bar, Mike let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He hadn't won the night, but he'd survived. And in Cronulla, that was enough to make him a bloody legend. Task 8. The Stolen Ute of Cook's River. Mike Rue Johnson was done. Done with the Sheilas, done with the Billies, and done with the endless brawls. His body still ached from his last round with Big Trev. His head spun from sparring with Donna, and his nerves were shot from the ever-looming chaos of the Shire. But this next task, this was personal. Nothing in the Shire was more sacred than a bloke's ute. It was more than a vehicle. It was a badge of honor, a symbol of status, and for Mick, it was the only thing in his life he could count on. That battered, mud-splattered ute had been with him through thick and thin, from nights on the piss to early mornings at the Bottle-O. It was his pride and joy, and now it was gone. "Mice! Some lowlifes nicked your bloody ute!" Shane-O came sprinting up to him outside the pub, out of breath, his eyes wide with panic. Mike's pint slammed down onto the bar, the frothy beer sloshing over the edge as his hand balled into a fist. His heart rate spiked immediately. "What do you mean it's nicked?" he growled, his voice barely restrained. The rage was already building, an old familiar anger that came whenever someone crossed the line. "Grubs from out west," Shane-O panted, hands on his knees. "Reckon they boosted it from the parking lot and took it over near Cook's River. Word is, it's Motza and his crew." Mike felt his blood boil. His hands twitched for violence, his jaw tightening as the fury coursed through him. His ute! His ute! The idea of some grubby eschees from out west putting their filthy hands on his pride and joy made his skin crawl. It wasn't just a car. It was his identity. The one thing that never let him down, the one constant in a life of chaos. "Bloody hell!" Mark roared, shoving his stool back and storming out of the pub. The thought of his ute being stripped or worse made him see red. It wasn't about the value of the thing. His ute was probably worth more in scrap than on the road. But it was the principle. It was his. Shane-O followed close behind, his voice low and grim. "Mate, listen, Mossa's notorious. He's the bloke everyone reckons runs Cook's River. Boosts cars, flips 'em quick, then disappears. Bloke's slippery. You can't just walk in there fists flying." Mike scoffed. "I don't need a plan. I need my ute back. They don't know who they're dealing with." His voice was cold, sharp. There was no room for reason when it came to this. "You can't be serious, Mick," Shano pleaded. "Mozart's got a whole crew with him. You walk in there solo, it'll be a bloodbath." Mike didn't care. Plans were for blokes who worried about consequences. He wasn't that bloke. All he needed was his fists and maybe a bit of luck. And he'd get his ute back or leave half of Moses' gang scattered on the pavement. Either way, he was getting what was his. He marched down the road toward Cook's River, Shano trailing behind like a concerned parent trying to stop their kid from doing something reckless. But Mike wasn't listening. His thoughts were laser-focused on one thing: getting his ute back. The Shire had rules, unspoken ones, but rules nonetheless. You didn't mess with a bloke's ute. That was sacred ground. Cook's River was a rough patch on the edges of town, a place where law and order didn't have much sway, and Mozart had made it his playground. Aishays on scooters patrolled the streets like they owned the joint, their sneers and graffiti marking every wall as a warning to outsiders. But Mick wasn't an outsider. He was a bloody local, and they had no right to take what was his. Mick didn't slow down as they approached the junkyard where Mozart was holed up. The air smelled of oil and burnt rubber, and the ground was littered with scraps of metal, old tires, and rusted-out shells, of cars long past their prime. Mike's eyes scanned the yard, spotting a few blokes lounging near a stripped-down Commodore, their S-shade trackies and bum bags confirming Shano's intel. "That's them," Shano whispered, though he needn't have bothered. Mike was already locked onto the group. His ute wasn't in sight, but it couldn't be far. He clenched his fists, his knuckles cracking, the familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Stay back," Mike muttered, barely glancing at Shano. This wasn't going to be a negotiation. It was going to be a statement. The blokes by the Commodore spotted him as he approached, one of them nudging the others with a snicker. They stood up, lazy and cocky, their postures screaming, "Untouchable." "What do we have here?" one of them jeered, a smirk playing on his lips. "You lost, mate." Mike stopped in his tracks, squaring his shoulders. "Where's my ute?" The smirk dropped from the bloke's face, and he exchanged a glance with his mates. "Don't know what you're talking about, mate, but if you're looking to buy, we got plenty for sale." His tone was dripping with condescension, but Mick wasn't in the mood for games. "I ain't here to buy. I'm here to take back what's mine," Mike growled. His eyes were dark, his hands twitching with the urge to start swinging. "Where's Mozart?" The group of blokes hesitated, their bravado wavering under Mike's glare. One of them, a skinny bloke with a bum bag slung over his shoulder, gestured toward a small shack at the edge of the junkyard. "Mozart's inside, but if I were you, I'd turn around now. Bloke's not one to mess with." Mike didn't even acknowledge the warning. He turned and marched toward the shack, his heart thudding in his chest, his pulse in his ears. He kicked the door open with a single, swift motion, and there, lounging on a torn-up couch, was Mozart. The bloke was exactly what Mick expected, scrawny but wiry, with a permanent sneer on his face and a ratty mullet hanging over his collar. He was surrounded by car parts, a few empty stubbies, and a half-finished joint burning in an ashtray. "You Mozart?" Mike barked, his voice low and menacing. Mozart barely looked up, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah? Who's asking?" Mick took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "Where's my ute, you thieving prick?" Mozza finally glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he realized who he was dealing with. "Ah, you're the one they've been a-talking about. The bloke from the Shire." He sat up, tossing the joint aside. "Look, mate, I don't have your ute. It's just business. Your ride's probably already been stripped by now, but if you want to have a look—" Before Mozza could finish, Mike lunged. His fist connected with Mozza's jaw, sending the bloke sprawling off the couch. The sound of bone meeting bone echoed through the shack, and Mozza let out a strangled groan as he hit the floor. Mick stood over him, his chest heaving with anger. "Where is my ute?" Mozza held up a hand, blood trickling from his mouth. All right, he gasped. "It's in the back lot. Haven't touched it yet." Mick glared down at him for a moment longer before turning on his heel and heading for the lot. Sure enough, there it was, his beloved ute, sitting untouched in the corner of the yard. He could have kissed it. Mick walked up to his ute, running a hand along the dusty hood. Relief washed over him as he climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life like it had never been gone. With one final glance at Mozza's shack, Mick peeled out of the yard, the satisfaction of victory settling in. No plan, no backup, just fists, fury, and a ute that was his once again. In Cronulla, that was all you needed. Task 9, the case of the crooked cop. Mike Rue Johnson wasn't exactly on good terms with the cops. Then again, not many blokes in Cronulla were, especially when you lived your life the way Mick did, jumping from one scrape to the next, dodging fines and constantly towing the line between a good night out and a night in the slammer. It wasn't that Mick was a bad bloke. It was just that trouble seemed to follow him like a stray dog with a bone. He'd always managed to wriggle his way out of sticky situations before, but this time things were different. "Constable Greggy's on to you, mate," Shano muttered over the clink of schooners and the din of the RSL. It was a quiet afternoon, the pub still half empty, but Shano's voice had that serious edge that told Mick this wasn't just idle gossip. Mike grunted, his fingers tracing the rim of his beer glass. "What now? What's the bastard want?" Greggy? The name alone was enough to make the hairs on the back of Mike's neck stand up. Constable Greggy wasn't just any copper. He was one of the dodgy ones, the kind of bloke who'd take a bribe 1 minute and then slap cuffs on you the next if he felt like it. Greggy had his own set of rules, and Cronulla was his playground. If you didn't stay on his good side, you were done for. "He reckons you're involved in that brawl with Big Trev last week," Shano continued, taking a swig of his beer. "Says he's got witnesses who'll put you right in the thick of it." Mike rolled his eyes. "Trev was asking for it, mate. You know how it is." "Yeah, well, Greggy don't care. He's been looking for a reason to nail you for months. Reckons if he doesn't pin this on you, you'll slip away like you always do." Mike sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Greggy wasn't the kind of copper you could avoid forever. He had a way of finding you, cornering you when you least expected it, and then tightening the screws until you had no choice but to play his game. And Greggy's game, it was dirty, real dirty. "All right, so what's his deal?" Mike asked, finally breaking the silence. "What's he want from me?" Shane O leaned in, glancing over his shoulder as though Greggy could materialize out of thin air. "He wants a favor, mate. You know how it goes. He'll make that brawl disappear, but only if you do something for him." Mick raised an eyebrow. "What kind of favor?" "Word is, there's some cash floating around, black market stuff. It's been going missing, and Greggy wants it back. Not for the station, mind you. For him. Reckon he's trying to build himself a little retirement fund." Mike wasn't surprised. Greggy had always had his hand in something crooked. Rumors floated around Cronulla like seagulls at the beach, and most of them had Greggy's name on them. Illegal bets, payoffs from dodgy developers, even the odd whisper about drugs being shuffled around under his nose. Greggy wasn't the type to keep his hands clean, and now he wanted Mick to get them dirty for him. "Right," Mike said, leaning back in his chair. "So he wants me to do his dirty work, and in return he'll wipe the slate clean." Shano nodded, eyes flicking towards the door. "Exactly. But you gotta be careful, Mick. Blokes who get involved with Greggy don't come out of it looking good. You gotta play it smart." Mike drained the rest of his beer and let out a long sigh. He didn't like it, but he didn't have much choice. He wasn't about to spend the next few months dodging court dates and fines, and he definitely wasn't going to let Big Trev walk around telling people he'd gotten Mick locked up. "All right," Mick said, standing up and grabbing his flannel from the back of the chair. "Let's go see what the bastard wants." The streets of Cronulla were quiet as Mick made his way down to the station, Shane O trailing behind him. The sun was setting, casting a reddish glow over the water, and for a brief moment Mick felt the weight of the whole Shire pressing down on his shoulders. This wasn't just about Greggy. This was about the whole bloody system, about how the blokes who played it straight always got shafted, while blokes like Greggy made the rules and twisted them to suit themselves. When they reached the station, Greggy was already waiting outside, leaning against his squad car with a cigarette hanging from his lips. He looked as slimy as ever, his uniform stretched over a gut that was fed on bribes and backdoor deals. "Mike," Greggy said, blowing out a cloud of smoke as he approached, "I've been expecting you." Mike didn't bother with pleasantries. "Shano says you got a job for me. What's the deal?" Greggy grinned, his yellowed teeth gleaming in the twilight. "Straight to business, I like that. Here's the thing. There's a bloke I need you to keep an eye on. Real dodgy type. Goes by the name of Baza. He's been poking his nose into my affairs, and I don't like it." Mike crossed his arms. "What's that got to do with me?" Greggy flicked the ash from his cigarette and took another drag. "Baza's been sniffing around a certain stash. Cash that don't belong to him. I need you to find out where he's stashed it, bring it back to me, and make sure Baza doesn't poke his nose anywhere else." "And if I do this, you'll drop the brawl charges?" Mick asked, his voice hard. Greggy smirked. "That's the deal. You help me, I help you. Nice and clean." Mick snorted. "There's nothing clean about this, Greggy, and you know it." Greggy shrugged, tossing his cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his boot. "Life ain't clean, Mick. You either play the game or the game plays you." Mike stared at Greggy for a long moment, weighing his options. He hated the idea of working for the bastard, but he hated the idea of sitting in a cell even more. "All right," Mick said finally. "I'll do it." Finding Baza wasn't hard. Cronulla wasn't exactly a big place, and blokes like Baza stood out like a sore thumb. He was holed up in a dingy little flat near the train station, the kind of place where the carpet hadn't seen a vacuum in years, and the walls were stained with the smell of old cigarettes and cheap booze. Mick didn't bother knocking. He kicked the door in with one swift motion, startling Baza, who was hunched over a pile of cash spread out on the coffee table. "Oi!" Baza yelped, jumping to his feet. "What the hell, Mike?" "Relax, mate," Mike said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just need to have a chat." Baza eyed him warily. "What kind of chat?" "The kind of chat where you tell me where the rest of this cash is stashed, and I walk out of here without busting your face in." Baza swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. I don't know what you're talking about, Mick." Mike stepped forward, looming over him. "Don't play dumb, Baza. Greggy's on to you, and now I'm on to you. You've got two choices: hand over the stash, or I leave you here for Greggy to deal with. And trust me, you don't want that." Baza hesitated for a moment before his shoulders slumped in defeat. All right. It's in the back room, under the floorboards." Mike nodded, satisfied. He didn't like this. Working for Greggy felt like swimming in a pool of filth, but he'd made his choice. Now he just had to finish the job and hope it didn't come back to bite him in the arse. An hour later, Mick stood outside the station again, this time with a duffel bag full of cash slung over his shoulder. Greggy was waiting, his smirk wider than ever. "Good job, Mick," Greggy said, reaching for the bag. "Knew I could count on you." "Yeah, well," Mike muttered, handing over the duffel. "We're square now, right?" Greggy grinned. "We're square, for now." As Mike walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a deal with the devil. Task 10. Shark's Curse. Mike Rue Johnson sat at the end of the bar in Cronulla's grimmiest pub, staring down at his beer like it held the answers to life's mysteries. His knuckles were still sore from the last scrap, his body bruised from a week's worth of benders and brawls, but the sixth labor loomed over him like a bloody storm cloud. There were no meathead gym junkies or dangerous Sheilas this time, no dodgy cops or stolen utes. This one was different, more than a simple biff. This was about the heart of Cronulla itself. "The Sharks, mate," Shano said, sliding onto the stool beside him, his voice low, conspiratorial. "You gotta break the curse." Mike raised an eyebrow and took a swig of his schooner. "A curse, huh? What am I, some kind of bloody wizard now?" "Nah, mate, but listen, every bloke in the Shire knows the story. The Sharks have been cursed ever since they formed. Never won a premiership. Got close, yeah, but never took the bloody thing home. If you break that curse, Mick, you'll be a legend, bigger than Wally Lewis, bigger than bloody Alfie Langer. You'll be king of the Shire, the Sharks, Cronulla's beloved NRL team, the pride and frustration of every local footy fan. They'd come close to glory more than once, only to choke at the final hurdle. No one could explain it. Year after year, they built up hope, and year after year they tore it down. It was like there was something supernatural holding them back. Some blokes reckoned it was just bad luck. Others swore there was more to it. A curse, they said. A dark, ancient force haunting the Shire's team, keeping them from ever tasting victory. "And how am I supposed to break this curse?" Mike asked, rolling his eyes. "I'm not exactly a bloody priest, mate." Shano leaned in closer, his breath stinking of cheap bourbon. "There's a relic, mate, an old footy jersey buried somewhere near Shark Park. They say it belonged to the original coach, from back when the team first started. Bloke had a heart attack on the sideline during the first game, died before he could even see his boys play. They reckon his ghost cursed the team, buried his jersey as some kind of hex. If you find it, dig it up and burn it. The curse'll be lifted. Mark shrugged, knocking back the rest of his beer. That it? Dig up some old jersey and set it on fire? Sounds easy enough. Shano shot him a grave look. Easy, mate. It's never easy. Every bloke who's tried reckons the curse damn near swallowed them whole. The grounds around Shark Park, they're haunted. Not just by that old coach, either. There's something dark there, something old. You go out there and start digging, you're going to stir it up, and it'll come for you. Mike snorted. Mate, I've faced Big Trev, wrestled Knuckles, and survived Donna. If some ghost reckons he can take me down, he's welcome to try. The night was thick with fog as Mike stood outside Shark Park, a battered shovel in one hand, a half-crushed durry in the other. The stadium loomed like a ghost in the mist, its lights off, the field empty, but it still pulsed with the energy of thousands of shattered dreams. Mike wasn't much for footy. He watched the odd game, cheered when the Sharks scored. But he wasn't the die-hard fan most of his mates were. Still, the weight of the place, the sheer frustration and passion that hung in the air, got to him. He tossed the ciggy, spat on the ground, and started walking. Shano had given him rough directions, pointing out the old stand where the coach supposedly croaked it mid-game. Near there, Shano had said, but it won't be easy to find. Mick rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar tension settle into his muscles. It had been a while since he'd dug up anything, but his old man used to drag him out to the yard to dig holes for fence posts or tree stumps, so he wasn't a stranger to the shovel. Still, this wasn't about breaking soil. This was about breaking something bigger, something that had gripped Cronulla for decades, leaving grown men in tears after every lost grand final. He reached the spot, or at least what he reckoned was the spot, and jammed the shovel into the dirt. The sound it made sent a shiver down his spine, but he ignored it. He wasn't here to piss about. The faster he got this done, the faster he could grab a kebab and get back to the pub. The shovel clanged against something hard. Mike froze. His heart thudded in his chest, but he couldn't tell if it was from nerves or excitement. He knelt down, scraping at the dirt with his hands, feeling the cold soil under his nails, until finally he saw it, a tattered, muddy bit of cloth poking up from the ground. Bloody hell, Mike muttered, yanking it free. The thing was ancient, a ratty old Shark's jersey, its colors faded and torn, the fabric stiff with age. As soon as he pulled it from the earth, the wind picked up, howling through the empty stadium like a wild beast. The air turned cold, colder than it should have been on a Cronulla night, and Mick could feel something watching him. He stood up, clutching the jersey, glancing around. The fog thickened, swirling around him like a living thing, and for the first time in a long time, Mark felt a flicker of fear. It was as if the stadium had come alive, the ghosts of decades' worth of losses, heartbreaks, and shattered dreams circling him, waiting for him to screw up. "No way, you bastards," Mike growled under his breath, lighting the durry he'd stashed behind his ear. He flicked the lit end onto the jersey, watching as the flames took hold. They started slow, licking the fabric with small, cautious tongues of fire, but within seconds the whole thing was ablaze. As the flames climbed higher, the wind howled louder, almost like it was screaming. Mike stood his ground, staring into the fire, willing it to burn hotter, faster, hoping the curse, or whatever the hell it was, would go up with it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The wind died, the fog thinned, and the stadium fell into an eerie silence. The jersey, now nothing more than ash, fluttered to the ground, carried off by the breeze. Mick stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where the relic had burned, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. No ghosts, no voices, no sign that the curse had been broken. Just silence. "Reckon that's it, then," Mike muttered, tossing his durry and heading back to the road. He didn't need to stick around for confirmation. The Shire would let him know if the curse was broken soon enough. He might not have lifted the Sharks to victory just yet, but one thing was certain. If anyone was going to break the curse, it'd be the bloke who dug it out of the ground and burned it to ashes. Task 11. Kebab of Destiny. Mike was just about ready to call it quits. He'd survived Big Trev, wrestled Knuckles, faced down Donna, reclaimed his stolen ute, outwitted Constable Greggy, and even took a crack at lifting the bloody shark's curse. But as he slouched at the back of his favorite kebab shop, Costa's, the unmistakable voice of Shano, echoed through the haze of garlic sauce and late-night stupor. "Oi, Mick, reckon there's one more labor, mate." Mike's eyes rolled so far back he thought they'd pop out. "What now, you drungo?" "The holy grail of all challenges," Shano said, eyes wide with awe. "The kebabs of destiny." Mike nearly choked on his mouthful of HSP. "What in the bloody hell are you on about now?" "Legend has it," Shano whispered, leaning in as though the kebab shop was bugged by ASIO, "that there's a special kebab, right? Perfect ratio of meat to tabbouleh, dripping in garlic sauce and wrapped so tight it never falls apart. But only the chosen one can order it. Only the true king of Cronulla's streets can finish it without spilling a drop on his flannel." Mike blinked. "You've lost the plot, mate." "I'm dead set serious," Shano insisted. "It's the final test. Every bloke's tried, but no one's ever managed to conquer the kebabs of destiny. Costa keeps it behind the counter, waiting for the chosen one." Costa, the kebab kingpin himself, stood behind the counter, slicing meat with the precision of a surgeon. His eyes flickered towards Mick and Shano, a sly grin playing at the corner of his lips. He knew they were talking about the fabled kebab. Mick wiped the grease off his hands and sighed. "All right, I'll do it, but only 'cause I'm bloody starving." The entire kebab shop went quiet as Costa approached the counter. "You sure you're ready for this, Mick?" Costa asked, his thick Greek accent adding to the sense of gravitas. "This isn't just any kebab, mate. This is destiny on a plate." "I've come this far, haven't I?" With a solemn nod, Costa disappeared into the back, the sizzle of meat and the crunch of fresh salad the only sounds that filled the shop. A moment later he returned, holding a kebab larger than Mike's arm, wrapped so tightly in foil it could have been used as a weapon. The room held its breath. This wasn't just a kebab. This was a test of endurance, patience, and intestinal fortitude. Mike unwrapped the foil, his heart thudding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of every bloke in the shop on him, waiting to see if he'd spill a drop of sauce. If he'd crack under the pressure, he took the first bite. Perfection. The garlic sauce was thick, but not overwhelming, the meat tender and juicy, the tabbouleh crisp and refreshing. But Mick knew this wasn't about the taste. It was about survival. Could he finish it without collapsing into a food coma or dribbling sauce down his flannel? Halfway through, sweat beaded on Mick's forehead, not from heat, but from the sheer weight of the kebab. It felt like it was expanding in his stomach, filling him up with every bite. His jaw ached, but he couldn't stop now. The crowd was watching, eyes wide, lips slightly parted, waiting for him to falter. Bite after bite, Mick powered through, his mind a fog of kebab-induced delirium. He could feel the garlic sauce threatening to spill, a single drop that would undo everything. But Mick, the battler that he was, managed to keep it together. The last bite came. Mike stared at it for a moment, his hand trembling slightly. This was it, the final bite of his final labor. He shoved it in his gob and chewed slowly, deliberately. The room was silent. Even Shane O held his breath. Mick swallowed. Not a single drop spilled. The kebab was gone, and Mick Rue Johnson, battered, bruised, and slightly nauseous, had done it. He'd conquered the kebabs of destiny. The shop erupted into cheers. Shane O slapped him on the back. Costa gave him a nod of respect, the kind you only get once in a lifetime. Mike grinned, wiping the last bit of grease from his chin. Reckon that's enough for one lifetime, eh? Bloody oath, mate. Shane O laughed. You're a legend now. Mick Rue Johnson had completed the final labor, and in doing so, secured his place as the true king of Cronulla. His flannel unstained, his stomach full, and his reputation solidified in the annals of Shire lore. Dad Drew opened his eyes to the smell of coffee. His head ached, his body was sore, and his mind was swimming with the strange remnants of a fever dream. He blinked, trying to shake the fog from his brain. Had it all been a dream? The 12 tasks, the gods, the trials of domestic life? It felt so real. But now, as he sat up in bed, it all seemed so distant, like a half-remembered story from his childhood. "Dad!" a voice called from the hallway. It was Tipsy, his daughter, peeking her head around the door. "You going to tell me a bedtime story?" Drew rubbed his eyes and smiled. "Yeah, bub. Give me a minute, all right?" As he stumbled out of bed and into the kitchen, he tried to piece it all together. The tasks, the dream, the strange sense of déjà vu that clung to him like a bad hangover. Strangling snakes, fighting washing machines, icing the beer. It was all there, somewhere in the haze of his mind. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took a long, slow sip. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, he had a story to tell. "G'day, mate,"